No matter who we are or what we do, all people deserve dignity, respect, and what we need to thrive. We believe this deeply. It's why we became social change makers. It's why we do what we do. But right now, the stories told say the opposite, that poverty is inevitable, that wealth is a result of hard work, that your economic status is a choice, that you don't work hard enough if you're poor.
If you had to work more than one job to have a roof over your head or food on the table, you probably shouldn't have taken the job that's not paying you enough. That'd be a you problem.
Placing the blame on individuals erases systems at work, helping the rich get rich and the poor stay poor.
Oh my God!
This is not an accident. It props up the status quo and distracts us from real solutions. Stories are incredibly powerful. They shape how we see the world. They tell us our history and how we move forward. As storytellers and change agents, we can dismantle these harmful narratives and write our own stories.
Hello, everybody. It's so good to see y'all here today, and I'm thrilled to be bringing this project home to Radcoms. I'm Shanelle Matthews. I'm the founder of the Radical Communicators Network, and I'm a collaborator on this award-winning project with the folks on the screen, Trina Stout, Hina Shaw, and Tommy Faust, plus a handful of others from Radcoms whose input helped to shape our work. The Radical Communicators Network is a community of practice for social justice communicators to cross-pollinate discussions across the various movements, organizations, levels of experience, geographies, languages, and political associations. This network incubates transnational connections, visionary narrative strategy, and collaboratively developed frameworks and best practices. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Anne, to introduce her team.
Hello and welcome. I'm Anne Searight Christiano. I'm the director of the Center for Public Interest Communications at the University of Florida. And our team was very proud to work as part of this initiative led by our research director, Annie Neiman, Rakeem Robinson, one of our research fellows, Jack Berry, a postdoctoral research associate, Matt Sheehan, our managing director, Lisette Tolentino, one of our research fellows, and Zachary Wallace, another one of our research fellows. Our team works together with partners around the world to apply social, behavioral, and cognitive science to significant communications challenges.
Hi, I'm Michael Huang. I am the managing director and founder of Millie. We are a creative agency, and we focus on work like narrative change and all the full spectrum of creative execution, as well as creative strategy. And for this project, my team and I led the branding and creative strategy for the entire project, from the brand building of it all the way to the dissemination distribution, including the video you just watched and the deck that we're presenting on. I just want to give a shout out to my entire team, multidisciplinary video production, design, strategy, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the way we approach design with intention on this project.
All right, so we're going to jump in to talk to you a little bit about how we got started. But before we do, we would love for you all to put into the chat, what is a trope that you learned about poverty or wealth? And where did you hear that message? What is a trope that you learned about poverty or wealth, and where did you hear that message? All right, so let's go into a little bit about the history of Broke. Slide, please. So in 2019, the Center for Public Interest Communications and the Radical Communicators Network co-applied for the Gates Grand Economic Challenge. We earned a small grant to collaborate on a project on poverty narratives. Joined by Millie, early on, we decided to focus on both poverty and wealth narratives to tell a more complete story, because poverty and wealth are two sides of the same coin. Broke combines the science of storytelling, applying what research tells us makes stories more memorable, inspiring, and actionable, narrative power, a type of power that shapes the norms and rules by which our societies live and helps us to expand the collective perception of what is socially, economically, and politically possible, and interactive design. We focused inward on the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors because although organizations are advancing liberatory narratives, other well-intentioned organizations invoke harmful narratives and tropes to demonstrate their effectiveness. They tell stories about how their organizations have contributed to the end of individual poverty. And when this happens, people with lived experience, the people who lived the stories, lose control over when and how their stories are used. Stories of individual triumph or success crowd out stories that help people see how systems are designed to privilege the few over the many. As a result, we come up with the wrong solutions. Broke, a colloquialism we use to describe when we're out of money, has become a stand-in for not having enough. And while it is often used flippantly, it distracts us from the broken systems that shaped and reshaped to advantage some and oppress others, as well as the stories that protect those systems, stories that insist poverty and wealth are the result of individual choices. This project synthesizes what we learned from the research and offers a set of recommendations grounded in the science of storytelling. To arrive at these recommendations, we conducted a literature review focused on understanding prevalent narratives about poverty and wealth, a content analysis zeroing in on the storytelling of anti-poverty organizations on social media, and interviews with practitioners who we think are doing it well. Altogether, we highlight bright spots and answer the questions: what are the narratives about poverty and wealth coming from the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors? Do these narratives demonstrate the best of what we've learned from research and practice about telling stories that transform systems? Stories are compelling. They shape narratives, narratives shape policies, and policies shape the material conditions of our lives. When we share narratives grounded in truth and a belief in the humanity of all people, we come up with more just solutions, build power, and change culture. With these tools, we provide the nonprofit and philanthropic communities with an easy to reference tool for communicating accurately and justly about how the rich got rich, why the poor stay poor, and how to use the science of storytelling to advance economic justice for all. It is also an opportunity for the nonprofit sector to confront the harmful narratives it perpetuates and to do better. Today, we're going to cover 4 things: what we learned collaborating across organizations, what we learned from studying how organizations are telling stories, how to tell stories about economic inequality and solutions for systems change, and how we approach design with intention. I'll start with what we learned from collaborating. Slide, please. In 2016, the Radical Communicators Network and CPIC began our relationship building toward more vital collaboration among academics who study communications and movement workers who practice communications in day-to-day movement building. In 2019, we co-applied for the grant to fund this research because we believed that we could do more together than apart. Combining our expertise could provide a powerful tool to the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors to add to their narrative change toolboxes. It's not often the philanthropic sector encourages this type of cross-organizational collaboration. By applying together, we believe that we were pushing the bounds of the sector to offer the most meaningful and transformative outputs for the field. Although we added additional labor to our project by co-applying and incorporating multiple disciplines, we think it was worth it. And working across organizations and disciplines and work norms, we believe that there was an opportunity to illustrate the world that we wanted, because how we interact must demonstrate the world we want to build. There's a term for this. It's called a prefigurative politic. It's the deliberate experimental implementation of desired future social relations and practices in the here and now. Prefigurative politics is not an alternative to revolution. It's about what successful revolution requires. Prefigurative politics is a concept coined by American academic Carl Boggs in the 1970s, and it aims to live into the values of the world we want to see. He writes, "It is the desire to embody within the ongoing political practice of a movement those forms of social relations, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are the ultimate goal. This is based on the premise that the ends a social movement achieves are fundamentally shaped by the means it employs, and that movement should therefore do its best to choose means that embody or prefigure the kind of society they want to bring about." And we tried our very best to do that, and I'll share a few quick examples. We shared decision-making. If we want to build a new egalitarian society that is empowering and transformative, we must create and participate in activities and practices that are themselves egalitarian, empowering, and transformative. From the premise of the project to the final copy edits, everyone was given a chance to offer their insights and feedback, and those were respected. We valued everyone's labor, and so we paid everyone. We rejected notions of perfectionism. We supported each other when we had personal or professional emergencies. We celebrated each other's work, and we held each other gently accountable. Like all projects, this project had challenges. We struggled with clarity on roles and responsibilities, with calendars and schedules, and we had to work on this project through the pandemic. And I want to say something else that feels important. When we applied for this grant, we were under no assumption that $100,000 or a single project would undo centuries of anti-poverty and anti-poor people propaganda. We know that nonprofit and philanthropic infrastructure is limited in its power to transform economic systems. As Sarah Jaffe, author of Work Won't Love You Back, How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone explains, charity is necessarily asymmetrical and reproduces inequalities. The problems of today's nonprofit sector are outgrowths of this necessary inequality. Nonprofits exist to try to mitigate the worst effects of an unequal distribution of wealth and power, yet they are funded with the leftovers of the very exploitation the nonprofits may be trying to combat. However, even before charitable infrastructure existed, exploited people resisted and sought to remake systems grounded in cooperation and collaboration to meet their needs. Our task as movement workers is to take our work as far as possible, to break through the ceiling, to develop new systems and processes to advance social justice and revolution, to measure success in terms of happiness instead of stakeholder profits, to normalize that less is more by rejecting economic growth as more fundamental than the physical, mental, and collective health of communities, and to make relationships, not transactions, the axis on which our togetherness turns. This project is one small step in that direction. As I mentioned, this was a multidisciplinary project. When we started this project, we shared knowledge by providing teach-ins to help us understand each other's disciplines, the science of storytelling, narrative power, and design. The Center for Public Interest Communications explores what science and research tell us about why stories work. They synthesize scholarship from multiple disciplines to help inform journalism and communications leaders and practitioners on how to break through the noise and work toward the greater public good. Their work reflects the best thinking from scientists interested in storytelling. Millie is a values-based creative agency specializing in strategy, content creation, and social media, and a member of RadComs. They leverage the power of technology, art, and culture to create a more connected, engaging, and just world. And as many of you know, RadComs exists to provide radical and progressive communications workers with political education and networking, and to politicize movement and nonprofit workers toward a power-based framework for movement communications efforts. We believe our communication strategies must be rigorous, inoculate us against co-optation, and not inadvertently service the status quo of power and privilege. And one way we do this is by ensuring our organizations, coalitions, and movements use a narrative framework that builds ideological power for a liberatory society. Unfortunately, not all frameworks within social justice and nonprofit communications work to subvert oppressive systems, and many reinforce them. Narrative power for social justice goes beyond a cursory understanding of a problem, using symbolic resources, including words, signs, images, messages, music, and even our bodies, to radically shape the rules and norms by which we live. All that said, I want to recap 3 best practices for radical collaboration among movement organizations, nonprofits, and capacity building formations within social justice. Do not assume that you can't push the bounds of a project for more effective, collaborative, and radical approach to movement building and narrative power building. That's 1. 2, practice a free prefigurative politic by living into the values you want to see in the world inside of your project, in your everyday life. And finally, embrace cross-discipline approaches to the work to make the project more effective and more impactful. And before I pass it on to Trina, please answer the next prompt in the chat. What are some things you'd like to do but feel restricted by the nonprofit and philanthropic sector? What are some things that you'd like to do but feel restricted by the nonprofit and philanthropic sector? Trina, on to you.
Thank you. Okay, so Anne and I are going to talk about what we learned studying how organizations are telling stories. Next slide. First, we did a literature review, a content analysis, and then interviews. And Anne will get to that. But first, next slide, we first looked back at narratives on poverty and wealth, because today's narratives did not just come out of nowhere. Many of them are hundreds of years old. And as Culture Hack Labs reminds us, narratives can evolve, mutate, disappear, and converge. This all matters because narratives guide our decisions and behavior. Narratives beget policies, which beget narratives, which influence how we treat each other, and on and on and on. You can take a look at all of these narratives in our timeline at brokeproject.org, but we wanted to focus on just 3 today. Thanks. So first, a reminder that it wasn't always this way. It doesn't have to be this way. Many Indigenous communities practiced and continue to practice various types of gift economies. Edgar Villanueva tells us that many native languages did not even have a word for poverty. The closest thing was to be without family. And I just want to share this brief quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer about how wealth is understood in a gift economy. In a gift economy, wealth is understood as having enough to share, and the practice for dealing with abundance is to give it away. In fact, status is determined not by how much one accumulates, but by how much one gives away. The currency in a gift economy is relationship, which is expressed as gratitude, as interdependence, and as the ongoing cycles of reciprocity. A gift economy nurtures the community bonds which enhance mutual well-being. The economic unit is we rather than I, as all flourishing is mutual. So again, there used to be these narratives of reciprocity and interdependence, but then at some point, Europeans took a wrong turn. And by the 1600s, we get two that I wanted to pull forward today: predestination and the Protestant work ethic. Predestination, just briefly, was the Puritans' belief that God chose some people, the elect, to be saved and everybody else was damned. But how could you tell who was who during life on earth? And they decided that you could tell who was who by who was prosperous and who was poor. And this is important because this is the first time that we get narratives of poverty as justified, as even divinely ordained. And so this is the first time that we get this concept of the undeserving poor, people who do not deserve sympathy because they brought their poverty on themselves through moral failure. Somehow before they were born back then, but now just this idea of moral failure of bad choices. So aiming to prove that they were among the elect and not the damned, Protestants practiced hard work and self-denial, which led to wealth accumulation. The Protestant work ethic valued work for its own sake rather than for its results, and it replaced the Catholic belief that one should only acquire as much wealth as one needed to live well. Narratives of work itself and of wealth as morally good persist to this day. The reification of billionaires, the grind, hustle culture, putting in long hours, etc. Next slide. The other one we wanted to highlight today, because it is still very pernicious and insidious, is individualism. This is also known as the bootstraps myth, which I saw come up in the chat when Shanelle asked for tropes. It's also known as meritocracy. And it says an individual can lift themselves up the social and economic ladder through individual effort, hard work, and personal responsibility alone, without the help of government. This concept of the self-made man. These narratives blame individuals for their failures and credit them for their successes, when in reality, thousands of government policies and employment, pay, education, housing, banking, law enforcement, the courts, healthcare, and other institutions operate every day to largely determine people's economic outcomes. And before I hand it off to Anne, what are some narratives around poverty and wealth that you see nonprofits and philanthropy using today specifically? Anne?
Thanks so much, Trina, and thank you, Shanelle. So I'm really eager to share the research findings with you all. And in our literature, we looked at recent peer-reviewed papers and books by scholars who are studying nonprofits, philanthropy, and the social change sector, and narratives on economic justice in particular. And we found that there has not been much research on this intersection, especially about narratives in the United States. So we found 12 academic case studies that were specifically focused on narratives on poverty or wealth in the nonprofit sector, and focused on 5 of them. So these case studies, these 5 case studies, studied the types of stories the sector was sharing on poverty and wealth. And if you look at the next slide, you can see in the middle column the name of the organization, and in the last column, the citation. And if you want to go deeper on this, there's a lot on this in the methodology in our report. But let me get to what's important about all of this, which is the 5 insights that we had, or the main insights that we had from this report, from this scan. The first is that organizations share stories of individuals who were able to become contributing members of a capitalist society by joining the middle class or starting businesses. So success in this theme was tied to an individual moving on from lower classes into middle classes, and entrepreneurship was often highlighted as upward mobility. We also saw that people who live in poverty were absent from the stories that are told about them, and were often portrayed as being a homogenous group without distinction or any nuances of their lives. We saw that organizations share partial stories about poor people, only sharing aspects of their lives related to being poor or getting out of poverty. And so if the organization was highlighting someone moving out of poverty, that's all they would focus on. They would not focus on them as complete human beings with interests, hobbies, families, or other things that would make us see them as full people. And what was even more startling was that organizations were not sharing stories about those that did not move out of poverty. Those tougher to hear stories were almost completely absent. We also saw that stories promoted individual level change over system level change, even when the organization actually acknowledges that systemic change is needed. So we think that this is a result of organizations having to tell stories that build their credibility or uphold their existence as an organization. And obviously, these organizations need to tell stories for funders and donors that highlight their work, but this tends to make them tell individual success stories while still acknowledging that it's the systems that need to change. And we saw that stories about people in other countries often oversimplified poverty by featuring people in pastoral settings. And so we saw a lot of pictures of people smiling on farmland, which is sort of an interesting narrative in itself. And finally, we saw that organizations aren't sharing stories about wealth. And so that lack of focus on wealth leads to ignoring the fact that poverty, wealth, and wages are all inextricably linked, and that the way things are and increasing inequality are sort of natural phenomena that are just going to be the way that things happen. But we know better from Economics 101, where tax scales and government distribution are choices we make through policy. So let's look at the content analysis that we did. We wanted to look beyond what academics were saying, so we looked directly at the content that was being put out by the sectors. And we surveyed two large networks, the RadComs network and the Frank network. RadComs is 8,000 people. Frank network is 3,000 people. And we asked people to provide us with a list of social change organizations working on economic justice issues. And we got a huge list of hundreds of organizations. And then we did social listening, which is a technique of combing through content on social media and then looking particularly at topics to see which of these organizations had the largest media reach relative to their size. And we broke these organizations into different categories to capture the diversity of the sector. And we pulled the top 10 organizations in terms of their social media reach and pulled 27 pieces of relevant recent content from their websites or social media for the content analysis. And the content, to be part of this, the content had to be on sections of their website, features as a story or called a story on social media. And it had to be focused on inequality or economic justice and relevant to the work of the organization. And then we did a qualitative analysis, which we translated into a worksheet that's linked to on the Broke website. And just a side note that there are a ton of worksheets to help apply these principles on the website. We coded the stories and we looked for the elements that we know makes them persuasive and compelling. But also, like, does the story talk about class structure? Is there a story arc? Does the story have interactions between characters and systems? Is there conflict in the story? And does the story include acknowledgement of systems of racism, white supremacy, classism, sexism, and ableism, and how they might be affecting people? Does the story consider historic, geographic, economic, political, or social factors? And also we look for who was the hero and who had agency in the story. Did the story reinforce any dominant narratives such as deservingness or the American dream, the themes that Trina mentioned? So here's what we learned from that. Again, these findings are from 27 pieces of content. So we want to be clear about that limitation. This is not a comprehensive look at the sector. But the findings have been affirmed by those in the sector that we've talked to, especially in presenting Broke. So let me dive in with that caveat. First, on the top left-hand side, you see 75% of the organizations were not telling actual stories with a beginning, middle, and end, conflict and resolution, and characters and setting, which is frustrating because we know that we have no more powerful tool than stories that include all of these elements. And if we're not including those elements, we lose the cognitive benefits of effective storytelling. So one of the clear takeaways is to tell good stories with character development, plot lines, and story arcs. Second, we found that 40% of the stories represented poor people as a homogeneous group of individuals. And that's similar to what we saw in the academic research as well, where poor people were not given names or were any distinctions made among them. We saw that 41% of the stories were framed as poor people being in need of saving. And we think this might be because organizations really do need to keep up those donations and present themselves in a good light for funders. So they often have to paint themselves as the hero coming in to save folks from poverty, or in other words, selling their success. But this comes at the expense of possible collective action and showing what that really looks like. Fourth, 31% of the stories included reference to systems of oppression. However, more than half didn't reference race or racism. And we think that this is a really important missed opportunity because it's important to show what it looks like when people are experiencing these and telling the stories about how systems about race shape experience that people have in our society. And finally, 70% of the stories featured organizations with power, but less than half the stories included characters as having power. And again, we think that these organizations are telling stories about themselves to demonstrate their effectiveness and legitimize their role in the sector. But there's a lot of space to do better by talking about what other organizations are doing and showing collective action as a solution to the problem rather than focusing on one's organization as a sole solution. So those are our insights. And I'm just curious, I would love to see you add, it says raise your hand, but let's do it in the chat. What do you think about these? Do these ring true to you? Do these feel right to you? So what are your reflections on these findings? So as you reflect on that, let's talk about what we actually do about this and how we can actually tell stories about economic inequality and solutions for system change. We were looking for positive narratives for economic justice, and we found organizations in the center that are doing a fantastic job telling stories about economic inequality and solutions for system change. So I also want to say that we think that a lot of times the harmful narratives often emerge out of trying to counter other harmful narratives. So as we think about displacing harmful narratives, we have to be really mindful that we're not creating a new harmful narrative. And so let's talk about the bright spots. These organizations came up in our research as bright spots of great storytelling work for economic justice. And we interviewed representatives from each of these to understand their approach to storytelling, because we saw that what they were putting into the world were these beautiful stories with strong narratives for economic justice. And what's really exciting is this is a really varied list. These are really different organizations working on a variety of issues. Some have huge comms departments, some don't have any comms, and they're focusing on different aspects of the policy solutions to this. So I want to walk you through 8 ways that you can tell stories for economic justice, and then we're going to dial down on 4 of them. So we go deep on all 8 in the report, but here we're going to talk about 4. So tell stories about individuals navigating systems and engaging in collective action to disrupt power. Use justice frames, build the capacity of communities to share stories, and amplify stories ethically. So let's look at that first one a little bit more closely. When we tell stories about systems and collective action, we need characters making decisions and interacting with system barriers and systemic oppression. So we can understand and see with our own eyes or hear with our own ears and feel through the character's experience what systemic oppression looks like and feels like. When we hear a good story, when we experience a powerful story, it feels as though it has happened to us. So at the same time, when we feel that character's experience with systems, we need to see that character has agency and they're part of a group of people engaging in collective action. Where the moral of the story is not to give to this organization or see people pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but rather systems change happens when we collectively come together and fight for something different. So for an example, let's look at Southerners on New Ground. This is an organization that has values that are deeply tied to their identity as LGBTQ plus Black activists. So every single thing they do, how they define the problems, how they define the solution. Not sure what that was. Comes from an intersectional lens. And the solutions that they're offering are about collective action, about people coming together to change systems. So how might you tell stories that feature systems as settings and characters engaging in collective action? And I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about that. So our next principle is to use justice frames in storytelling. Scholars define frames as having both a definition of the problem and a definition of a solution. And so practitioners might step back and say, how are we defining the problem and the solution? And does this frame move us toward justice, or does this frame offer something that is counterproductive to the world we're trying to create? For example, let's take a look at Immokalee farm workers, who are also just doing amazing work in this space of storytelling. So Immokalee farm workers tell stories about fast food workers and farm workers and the inhumane conditions that these workers are often in. They offer solutions not just about the workers coming together, but also customers coming together to support the workers through their purchasing power to demand stronger labor protections. So if you look at their content, it has this justice frame throughout, and you can see the demand for justice in the language seen in this picture from one of their rallies. So as you think about your storytelling, think about how you frame the problem and the solution as justice and injustice. Repeating the names of the last two mentioned organizations, going back is Southerners on New Ground and Immokalee farm workers. I also want to talk a little bit about how we can amplify stories ethically. So Invisible People does this really, really well. They tell stories of individuals who are experiencing homelessness in their own words. And they also tell scripted documentary stories about eviction and what it means to live without a home. They go out into the streets and directly interview people and post their interviews unedited on YouTube. But they do so in an ethical manner by treating the interview subjects just like any other partner on a project. They ask if it's okay to share the story online, and the storyteller can have that story taken down at any time. They pay people at an actor's rate and compensate them for their time. So the people who are being interviewed are partners in the project and experts over their own stories, which obviously they are. So as you think about storytelling, how are you taking care of the storytellers, and how will you create a plan for taking care of the storytellers and making sure that they have agency over their stories? I want to share an amazing example of this kind of story. And this comes from an organization called Migrant Justice. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat for a fantastic talk. The talk is called The Cows Don't Milk Themselves by Enrique Balcazar from Migrant Justice. And it really shows all of the elements of collective action, of lived experience, of telling stories of systems, and through this lens of justice and injustice. So I will put that in the chat now and encourage you to take some time and watch this just absolutely incredible talk after we're done today. So I want to hand over to Michael, and talk about design. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Anne. That was incredible. So much data, and it's great to hear all your guys' reactions to that. So as mentioned earlier, design and the creative strategy behind this project was a big part of how we put the project together and how it is showing up and how it's being disseminated now. And so I wanted to dive in a little bit on our process there to illustrate, how this project came together, but also to think about how our approach here from a design perspective and a creative perspective could be utilized as a tool for you all in your work, with whether it's about changing narratives around poverty specifically or any narratives out there that you guys are working on. So just a little bit kind of a centering around really what our role was as a creative agency. It's important to kind of take that step back and understand what creative plays a role, how creative plays a role in any kind of movement or social change work. It's really easy to lose your place in this type of work. So one mantra that has been a guiding light for my team and I is this quote by the late, great Tony K. Bambara. The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. It's important to recognize that creative gets often sidelined and often unintentionally, of course, for seemingly more important elements of a project, the content itself, the research, et cetera. And then we kind of just tack on the creative element at the end. But we should never forget that the role that art has played throughout the history, whether it's to change narratives or to create harmful ones. Creative and content and all of that is a big part of that ecosystem. Just to kind of give you guys, peel back the curtain a bit, the initial dialogue between a creative team and a larger project team, in this case, the research team, is a critical milestone. And although we weren't building a brand new organization per se, we treated this with that level of care. We worked together multidisciplinary to understand as creatives our proximity to the work itself, and respecting and honoring the academics, the scholars, the folks that were researching the subject material. And then in turn, we were given a lot of altitude and a lot of space as creatives to work around what we do best. And we did that early on in the project to infuse and to even guide the way that we wanted the project to end up. Often in an organization, I'm sure you all can relate in some way, these design elements or the guidelines get pieced together at the end of the project just to make sure that the PDF has a nice, beautiful stamp at the end of it. But if you do have the capacity, building an intentional brand platform, a design and visual platform, a visual treatment, a visual voice, with a specific approach to the core tenets, the values, and the elements that you do want to present, is a powerful tool for any foundation, any organization, any organizer. And so this research, this work that we did early on, showed up in a lot of different ways as we built the project and put it together, including that amazing video that you all saw at the beginning with Shanelle's powerful voice. We used a lot of thinking that connected to the subject matter, drawing on hyper-capitalistic culture, pop culture, consumer brands that really kind of connected our thinking and yours to the idea of consumption and the idea of being broke or having wealth. So of course the color is green, but you can see a little bit of Nike in there, or the Matrix, anyone. Our goal with this visual direction of the project was to not only create something beautiful, but deeply engaging and scroll stopping. And furthermore, we can't discount the impact of taking work like this and wrapping it in a visually stimulating and culturally relevant design. This can really take any project the extra mile, and it may even help reach the people who need to see it the most. And the result, as you have seen through the deck, through the video, through various elements, but also through the web page, if you guys have not visited yet, is more than just beautiful assets, but a powerful and flexible tool set that allows us and our multidisciplinary team and our decentralized team across many different types of organizations. We can execute, share, deliver, disseminate, distribute this project in various formats, various mediums, from social to downloadable worksheets. And we were able to create just a wide spectrum of content that really made this project powerful in the way of being able to show up in the way that people needed it to show up. So we leveraged static design, long form writing, video production, interactive web experiences. If you guys haven't been to the site, the historical timeline is really, really fun to kind of work through. And Trina's larger, robust research shows up in that way there. But storytelling, especially narrative change, really needs this level of visual intention, especially right now, to break through that clutter and truly achieve the impact in a world where we are saturated with so much of it. And diving just a little bit deeper into kind of the overall ecosystem of creative, and not just that, but creative strategy, we didn't just put together beautiful things here. We worked closely with this entire team to really craft an ecosystem of engagement across every element, especially while we were building this in COVID, not knowing what the world would look like, and knowing that there was an urgent need to start to build this kind of narrative change work. So really leaning on digital tools and understanding how we could maybe disseminate, utilizing social, utilizing our networks, utilizing web experiences. We wanted to make this experience ultimately the best that it could be in terms of meeting people where they were at, making it accessible, making it digestible, not just basically dumping a giant white paper on people and telling them to read it. This is really effective in the way of like making people feel very comfortable with sharing it, making people feel very comfortable with sharing tidbits about it, or creating different entry points for different folks who maybe have different proximities to this type of narrative change in this work itself. You know, in movement work, especially these heavy projects, you know, the research is considered that real work, and in a lot of ways it is. And then the designer kind of gets that bulk of it and has to figure out what to do with it. And I just want to give flowers to my team that, you know, we brought the design and the creative early on in the conception of the project, which allowed us to imagine this project showing up the way it is now, and in a lot of ways guided the type of content and the type of work we did, including the timeline, for example. So just a few takeaways to give to you all, again, in the context of, yes, we like to talk about the design of this project, but of course, every organization is different. Every team is different. Every individual has limitations. If you can, involve a design team or a designer from the beginning, if you know you're going to end up needing to do that, even if it's just to get their thoughts or to kind of brief them early on with a raw content document, it goes a long way for them to understand where the project is coming from and how it's coming together. Number two, map your audience's journey early on as well. Thinking about the engagement from people and not kind of just leaning on existing tropes, existing kind of best practices or existing behaviors like, oh yeah, we'll just email it out to everyone and make sure they'll just read it, right? But thinking about kind of critically like how you're going to end up sharing this content with them, and where your target audience right now kind of consumes content, what are their kind of gripes around the way they consume content, the challenges and barriers, what they're inundated with, and maybe trying to break away from that. And then three, leverage technology for, you know, flexible tools, right? You know, you don't have to do it all anymore. There's so much available to us. I'm not going to talk about AI, but you know what I mean, right? There's Google Slides, there's Canva, there's incredible tools out there that, albeit, you know, problematic in some ways, if they're leveraged in the way that you need them, they can really take a tighter team or less resources to a much more effective clip in terms of executing creating content, and really allowing your project to shine further than a document. All right, I'm going to hand it back to y'all. We're open for questions, observations. I know there's been a lot of chatter, but yeah.
And thanks to the team, Mike, Trina, and to all the folks who are not here who worked on this project, and also to Annie Neiman, who's our researcher who is on the call right now. Hi, Annie. So just wanted to speak to Juan Pablo's comment about the narrative-driven model. I don't know if I can speak to the effectiveness of it. There was another question about that, the effectiveness of storytelling in the justice sector. And I could see why you might call this project narrative-driven, but it's actually chock full of storytelling thinking, examples, research, and resources. And I think what we took into account was the importance of the broader power building efforts related to storytelling, which is that stories accumulate to shape broader societal narratives, and those narratives shape policies, and those policies shape the material conditions of everyday lives, which I think you know through your very important work. But in my opinion, it's not really strategic to bifurcate story and narrative, but to understand how they interact in political discourse, and more importantly, how we use stories to delegitimize oppressive and harmful narratives and paint a more liberatory vision of a future, the future that we desire. We talk a lot about narrative power, in part because part of RADCOM's hope is to matriculate people who use a market-based framework in their communications efforts to a power-based framework. So as opposed to using things like marketing, what it means to talk about ideas in relationship to power, and how systems impact people's everyday lives. So would love to have a deeper conversation about that at some point, but would love to pass it to my colleagues and see if you guys have anything else you want to add. It looks like this poll is up, Ariana, from the last session.
Yeah, I just ended the poll. Don't worry about that one.
Were there other questions folks had, or did anybody else want to chime in?
I see a great question in the chat from Elise Swin Pollard about calls to action, which is something that we think a lot about in the Center for Public Interest Communications, because when we work with our partners, we often see them sort of figuring out how to tack a call to action onto the end of an effort, rather than really starting out their work by thinking about what it is they want to change and what is changeable. So I think, figuring out those calls to action really starts with what is the necessary, visible, observable, possible change that is within your power or within the power of your community to achieve. And we have, I'll see if I can paste these in the chat here. Yeah, so we've, and Annie was an important part of developing this framework, a framework around calls to action, that they have to be meaningful toward the issue, that they have to be within the power of the community that you are offering them to, that they have to be possible, if not easy, that they have to be gratifying and specific and actionable, and something that it seems like people like them are doing, and also participatory, so people have a way to make it their own and include their own voice and lived experience in them. Oh, thanks, Trina, for adding that article. And I'm happy for anybody else to chime in on the question of calls to action, because I think it's a really important question, and one that I think we could give more attention to across the sector.
Well, I'll just say one thing that we haven't brought up, which is that narrative power isn't effective without organizing. And I feel like meaningful calls to action are related to how you get involved with everyday people who are making change in their communities. Like, it's one thing to say, call your senator, but we don't have meaningful pathways for people to do those things unless they're involved in an organization or receiving information from an organization. Like, if you're involved in electoral justice and you're a member of the Working Families Party, or and you can get those emails, and they have pretty succinct calls to action. But I think that it's just important we also think about the relationship between narrative power and people power, and rely on grassroots organizations like some of the folks that we mentioned, like Song and Immokalee Coalition, and listen to them and see what they're saying that people need to do and the actions that they need to take. And then I'm looking at Nicole's question. It was mentioned earlier, the danger of creating new problematic narratives while trying to reduce the impact of existing problematic narratives. Can you give some examples of where you've seen that happening? Yeah, I mean, right now, I'll just say one challenge that people who are advocating for the expansion of abortion rights are seeing is that there's a new messaging strategy around the safety net, and that if we have a meaningful safety net, we also do not need abortion access, which undercuts the very long fight for access to abortion. And so we are trying to thread the kind of conversation between access to bodily autonomy and access to meaningful wages and family temporary assistance for needy families and housing vouchers and so on and so forth, while also, and doing that can be challenging because a lot of these agencies can't talk about abortion. The safety net agencies, for example, can't talk about abortion explicitly. So that's one challenge that I'm seeing right now, is that we're creating this kind of this network of messages that say that abortion isn't necessary if we have these particular policies in place, which is hard. So anybody else want to chime in on that? Trina, are you saying anything, or Anne?
I would just mention that at the beginning of this conversation, when people were adding the tropes that they had heard, a lot of people mentioned this idea about poor people being lazy. And so in one of the efforts to displace that harmful, pervasive narrative, there was another one about people working hard and overcoming, which I think are really problematic because they create this expectation of exceptionalism and people overcoming an individual system rather than changing the system itself.
Looking at Mac's question, if some of my coworkers edit communications to soften the message to bring people along, aka not ruffle feathers of old rich white people. I've had the word justice removed from several pieces. For instance, how can I convince them that it's okay and normal to ruffle a few people for the greater good? I mean, this is really where organizing comes in. I really like that Rachel Reidinger from the Narrative Initiative uses the frame narrative organizing. Part of the reason why we actually focused on the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors is because we are susceptible to absorbing the oppressive and harmful narratives, just like everybody else, just like the folks that we're organizing to change their belief systems. And so this is precisely why this project was created, because we knew that people inside organizations reinforce oppressive narratives. And this is intended in the best way, right? To just like make sure that we don't upset people. But I think it takes time, and maybe you're not the best messenger for that. Maybe somebody else is. But would love to see if Anne or Trina, you have something to say about that. And then I think we need to close it up.
All I would add to that is when you really do find yourself in a situation where your challenge is around language, going to that visual language that describes something in a palpable visual way, I think is a really powerful way to show, rather than use the more abstract terms that can be filled with meaning by other people who may want to undercut the power of those phrases.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Please fill out the survey. We really appreciate it. We need your feedback, and we will see you at next month's RAD session. And be sure to go to brookproject.org and download all the resources. Thanks for coming.